So I'm going to start a series of video blogs, and this is the first in that new series. So the topic today is going to be unorthodox religious communism. And I've written about this in a couple of other places, particularly my two blogs. I have radicalprogress.info, which I'll put on the links below the YouTube page. And then the other one is leftistquaker.wordpress.com. I tagged the posts that deal with communism directly, but I don't think I've ever even there posted what I would kind of call a sort of summary of my view as an unorthodox religious communist, which is how I have to describe myself. Because every now and then, in various conversations, well, how do you identify? You know, are you a Marxist? Are you an anarchist? Are you, or even in religious circles, are you a Christian? Are you a Buddhist? Are you an atheist? And I would say, well, the answer to both questions is the same: unorthodox religious communist, which means that for me, my communism is an element of my religion, and my religion is itself a motivation for my communism. And communism for me is the best description, and unorthodox is important. I could get more specific, but usually the first thing I'm going to throw at you is, if you ask me, are you an atheist? Are you a Marxist? Are you an anarchist? I'm going to answer all those with the following: unorthodox religious communist. Most people say, wait a minute, communism is an atheistic philosophy and worldview. And I'd say, well, if you're ignorant of its history, yes, you would believe that. But in fact, communism began and was invented. The term itself was invented by a Christian by the name of Etienne Cabet. And he wrote the first book that had the term communism in it, and he explicitly based his formulation of communism on stories from the Christian Book of Acts of the Apostles, chapters 2, 4, and 6, you can look this up, where the early apostles and their followers shared all things in common, which they considered to be following the teachings of their crucified and resurrected Savior, namely Jesus. So the stories so the idea of abolishing private property, saying you don't own any of your wealth, you have to share it with the needy, and so on, with everyone. That the idea of a universal treasury, a common treasury, emerged. At least one strand of that idea comes from those early stories in the Book of Acts. Now, that said, there was a division that occurred as the modern communist movement, which I argue begins with Cabet, although there are precursors to Cabet, and I might mention them later in the video or maybe in a follow-up. Precursors to Etienne Cabet, people who advocated communism on Christian grounds. Cabet argued for communism somewhat on Christian grounds, but also he was somewhat of a heretic. So he also, argued that it was human nature that was naturally communistic. And that's a theme of modern communism. It's even a theme, I would argue, to some extent in other religious communists. Christian communists believe that we are by nature, God intended us to be communists, but it's sinfulness that keeps us from being communists. My personal journey actually towards communism began at a summer camp. I was a Pentecostal preacher's kid. Yes, I spoke in tongues, and I rolled in the aisles, and I danced in the Holy Spirit, and all of those things and was involved with faith healing and all those things. And I don't reject any of that technically. I mean, I understand it very differently now than when I was going through it and living out those kind of things. But again, this video isn't necessarily about my life story. It's more about where I'm at now. But during this Pentecostal summer camp, when I was, 5th, 6th grade maybe, there was a college choir that had come to sing for us. And we had this Q&A after one of their performances. We had this Q&A with the choir where us middle school, maybe young high schoolers could talk to these college kids about the Bible, about being in the choir or anything. And I don't know who asked this question, But somebody just asked the question, what do you think of communism? And one of the young women, the college-age woman, Pentecostal Christian, said, oh, communism is a beautiful idea, but people are too sinful. So I was in the group of kids, and I had this thought, well, what does that mean? If communism is a beautiful idea, what does sin have to do with it? It's God's idea. It's, if anything beautiful is God's idea. I didn't think this through explicitly, but I said, you know, communism is a beautiful idea. So God wants communism on the earth. That was my belief. And of course, I tied this to, you know, the end times and the return of Jesus when he would set up a millennial kingdom and it would be communist. That was the initial way I thought through what I meant by saying that I thought communism was God's idea. And of course, I later, you know, connected the idea of communism with those stories in the book of Acts, and then learned about Christian communists, people who lived communally, but also people who attempted to bring about communism on earth as a general social order. One of the earliest ones was in the city of Munster, which is in the Germanic territories. It was before Germany was actually a nation, but I don't know where in the Germanic territories. But the Munsterites were a group of Anabaptists who were not pacifists. They actually believed in, you know, taking up arms. Took over the city of Munster and instituted communism. They also instituted polygamy because apparently there was a shortage of men. So, you know, men had to be husbands to multiple wives. And so this, I don't know, it lasted a year, maybe less. And then it was, you know, taken down by the local prince who, you know, sent his soldiers in there and shut it down. So that was an attempt to create a Christian communism in Europe. And there have been communists identified, or people who are religious who have been identified as some kind of communism, going back to, you know, again, the New Testament itself, but also at different points in history, communism, the idea of a communism that is religious has emerged. You know, you can look at the monastic, most of the monasteries operate on a kind of communal organization system. And of course, the early communists, or I should say the Marxists and other communists, believed that there was in fact a primitive communist period of human history about the time we emerged from lower primates, and that we lived communally, that there was no surplus of wealth that we could distribute or even wall off using private property laws, that private property laws were only occurred as there was a surplus and there was a political struggle to control that surplus, and the result was that a ruling class came to control the surplus. And that, of course, sets up for Marxists, but I would also say for an unorthodox religious communist, that the early experience of humans was communal, and that it was only displaced through a political power struggle. And that struggle was, of course, over the surplus of wealth. So I'm about at the halfway point, and I've talked about unorthodox religious communism. But what do I mean by communism? Let me get specific. I talked about the abolition of private property, but there's a simple definition that I think everybody should memorize. It should be like required reading, that you know this definition. And it says, from each according to ability, to each according to need. And that's basically a division of labor, if you will. It says every person should only work as much as they're actually able to work. They shouldn't be forced to work long hours. They shouldn't be forced to work a lot of hours for somebody else. They should work for themselves for as many hours as they have the ability to work. They shouldn't be forced to do what's called alienated labor, or labor in which you're working for somebody else and they're extracting from you labor more or less under threat of starvation. So that's part one, from each according to ability. And part two is to each according to need. And so the Marxists believed that capitalism, but more than capitalism, industrial production, which was to some extent was part of capitalism, but there also can be distinguished. But industrial production, where you have a factory, you have small parts that can be combined into creating a thing, an object, a commodity, that industrial production system was generating a global abundance. And that over time, you would not need wage labor, that wage labor could be abolished, and yet the high abundant standard of living that was possible because of industrial production could be redistributed through a communist system. So I would say that's what the Marxist variant on communism taught, was that the abundance of capitalism and industrial production could be restructured under a communist distribution system and a communist system of apportioning labor, so that nobody had to overwork anymore and that most people had more free time. And in fact, that was sort of the main goal, according to Marx, is the abolition of labor. Not, and by labor I don't mean any work, but work that specifically was about earning a wage. Abolishing that, but letting people work as they needed to. And of course, some people think that that communism is only possible with robots. In other words, with automated systems of production. That once you have that, and you don't need people to work in a factory anymore. Okay, then we can have communism. And there's an interesting thing there, because capitalism depends in part on convincing people that they need things they don't really need. That you need that new car with the fanciest stereo and the tricked out carburetor. You need more than a person rationally needs. So, and communists debate over whether we're just going to fulfill needs or whether we're going to also fulfill wants. And some people, the more maximalist, would say yes, wants can be fulfilled for everyone. I'm in the middle ground on that. I think maybe, but I worry because as a communist, I believe that we have to care about the planet, and the planet is suffering. The Earth, with the fossil fuel extraction, the heavy metals, and the way they're poisoning our environment. You've got the oceans are being, all this carbon is going into the oceans and turning them acidic. All of this sort of processes of industrial production are harming the planet. And so I don't think the massive production system that we have is sustainable in its present form. That would need to be radically restructured, not just in terms of abolishing fossil fuels, but at some level we might have to make do with less stuff. There's just a little too much stuff. But again, I probably won't be involved in those decisions. I will probably die before there is a world communist order that will have to look at that question and sort of line it out. Here's how we create a sustainable global communism. So there's in a nutshell kind of what communism is about. Remember that definition, from each according to ability, to each according to need. And, think it through. Does that sound reasonable to you? If you believe that is a rational economics principle, which I believe, and most communists do, then you are a communist. You don't have to believe in Marx. You don't have to believe in atheism. You don't have to believe in religion. You don't have to believe in any of this stuff. You just have to say, that economic system makes sense to me. Now, why do I call myself an unorthodox religious communism? Why do I think religious communism, without the unorthodox, is important? And I would say it's important because the majority of humanity has been religious throughout its history. There has never been, with maybe a few exceptions, a majority atheist society. And those few exceptions are maybe some of the Scandinavian countries have come close to a majority of atheists. And many of the, and perhaps the communist nations that enforced atheism through their public education system, maybe they achieved a majority of atheism, but that's gone. Those countries are out of power and have reverted to whatever religion was dominant prior to the emergence of a communist government there. So religion, I would argue, is a universal human trait that goes back to caveman days when we had, paintings on the walls that have religious themes and angelic beings and spirits and so on. And rituals, where you burned incense and you got into trances and so on. I just think religion is part of the human condition. and it's a community experience, because there's, I'm just going to give an argument from my own experience. I am a Quaker, a member of a Quaker meeting, an unorthodox Quaker meeting. I would argue that we stand in the progressive tradition of Quakers. Progressive tradition is those who supported abolitionism, because many Quakers did not support abolitionism, despite whatever you may have heard about that. Many of the abolitionist Quakers were expelled from the official bodies of Quakers and had to create their own, which they tended to call progressive friends meetings. Short thumbnail history. There's actually books I can refer you to. As a Quaker, I go to a meeting, and it lasts about an hour, and we sit in silence for that hour. And if someone feels led to speak, they speak. But in that hour, we are invited to seek what we call seek the inward light. And the inward light, at one time, of course, meant Jesus or God, more, But as progressive friends have become more inclusive, universalistic, less Orthodox Christian, maybe not even Christian, post-Christian, ex-Christian. We've got Buddhists now in our meetings, we've got pagans in our meetings, and atheists in our meetings. We're not checking anybody's doctrines. We're saying, experience this moment of what we call meeting for worship. Worship bothers some atheists, but it's a word that we use. It doesn't mean what some people think it means, but this meeting that we have, you sit in silence and just listen for the inward light, and the inward light will tell you whether you belong there. And if you keep coming back, you belong there. And I have been coming back since 1997, when I started attending Quaker meeting regularly. And I've been involved in a variety of levels of the Quaker society, the religious society of friends. And again, there's no dogma to it. There's no, I have to believe a certain way to it. It's just, that experience of immersion in silence just does something inspirational to me. It helps me think through a little bit more each time why I'm on this planet. So again, I am a universalist. I am an inclusivist. I include everybody. My credo is all being is divine, all beings are part of the divine, and all beings includes every human being, as well as the plants and the animals on the planet, as well as beings on other planets. We're all beings are part of the divine. All being is divine, and that's my credo. And I'm not imposing religion. I believe that if you're an atheist, you're welcome to be a part of my religious community, and I share with you, if you are a communist, I share with you a political agenda. I may not interpret Marxism the way you do. I may not interpret Lenin or whoever else you're high on in the Marxist tradition. But in the end, I don't think those things are what really should matter. What matters to me is this goal of creating a world order of generosity and creative abundance for everyone, and that is sustainable, that doesn't destroy the planet with heavy industrial production. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm going to cut it off here because I'm right at the 20-minute mark. So I will put more videos up, I'm hoping, and this is my first attempt in many years, or a couple of years at least, to do one of these. So thanks for watching. Put your comments on YouTube, and I'll put some links to various things I've referred to. Peace.